Chapter 2 The Floor Guardians 1. Return, demons of Lemegeton! At Momonga's command, the ultra-rare ore golems returned to their seats and resumed their postures of vigilance on lighter feet than one would expect for their builds. The first thing Momonga had done upon resigning himself to officially wondering whether his fantasy world had indeed become the real one was to guarantee his safety. The NPCs he had met a moment ago all submitted to him, but that didn't mean the ones he would meet next would. Even if they did prove to be allies, there was no telling what dangers might lie ahead. His survival could very well depend on whether or not the tomb's facilities, golems, items, magic, etc. all functioned as in the game or not, which made confirmation of those things his most urgent priority. That should be good for now, Momonga said to himself out of relief as he surveyed the golems. He'd ordered them not to take commands from anyone else, so in the worst-case scenario of an NPC rebellion, he would at least have one way to protect himself. Satisfied with the robust figures of the golems, he looked down at his own finger bones. There were 9 rings on his 10 fingers. The only one that didn't have one was his left ring finger. In Yggdrasil, it was normally only possible to wear 1 ring per hand, but by purchasing an expensive cash store item with a permanent effect, Momonga had gained the ability to wear them on all 10, as well as use all the powers they contained. Not that that made him very special. If a player prioritized being strong, buying that item was a no-brainer. The ring Momonga was looking at now bore the same crest that was embroidered on the scarlet tapestry hanging behind the throne. It was a ring of Ainz-Ul-Gon, a magic item that every member of the guild possessed. He wore his on his right ring finger. He could use all the powers of 10 rings, but he'd had to choose which ones when he used the item that allowed him to equip that many. It was impossible to swap after the fact. Compared to his other rings, including the one he wasn't wearing, stored in the treasury, this one's power was pretty basic, but he wanted it at the ready, since, in certain circumstances, he used it far more than any of the others. The ring of Ainz-Ul-Gon let its wearer teleport freely to almost any named room within the Great Tomb of Nazarick. It was even possible to teleport in from outside. The tomb blocked teleportation magic except for in designated areas, so there was no more useful way to get around. There weren't very many places, save the throne room and the members' individual rooms, that couldn't be teleported to. Without this ring, however, there was no way to get to the treasury, so it wasn't something he would want to be without. Momonga exhaled deeply. He was about to exercise the ring's power, but he wasn't sure what would happen. Would it work as expected? He was anxious, but had to know. He unleashed the power, and his vision went dark, like he'd blinked. The scenery changed. Now he was in a dimly lit passage. The end was blocked by a barred gate. White artificial light came in through the gaps. "Success," he murmured, relieved that he'd been able to teleport. He set off walking down the broad, high-ceilinged passage toward the gate. The stone floor caused his footsteps to reverberate loudly. Flickering torchlight sent shadows dancing along the walls, making it seem like there was more than one of him. As he neared the gate, his nostrils, which should have just been holes leading to nowhere, were invaded by scent. He stopped to breathe in and out. A pungent green odor and the scent of earth. This was the smell of deep forest. Having his nose working again, like it had before with Albedo, even though it should have been impossible in the game's fantasy world, made Momonga feel even more strongly that this place was now reality. But with no lungs and no respiratory tract, how am I even breathing? He racked his brains, but soon realized trying to reason the problem out was ridiculous and abandoned the idea. When he got close enough, the gate drew quickly up into the ceiling like a well-timed automatic door. Passing beneath, Momonga saw the Colosseum, with its multiple levels of spectator seating encircling its central arena. It was an oval of 615 by 510 feet, 157 feet high, identical to the Colosseum built in Rome during the imperial period. Continual light was cast in various locations, throwing enough white light that he could look around the area and see as if it were high noon. There were too many seats to count, and in them, a great many clods of dirt. No sign of movement from the golems. This place was called the Amphitheatrum. The actors were captured raiders, the audience was made up of golems, and in the VIP seating would be the members of Ainzul Gone. What was on the program? A slaughter, of course. With the exception of the 1,500 in that huge raid, every intruder, no matter how strong, had met their end here. Momonga walked into the center of the arena, gazing up at the pitch-black night sky. If there hadn't been any light, he probably would have been able to see the stars. Of course, this was the 6th level of the Great Tomb of Nazarick. Being underground, the sky hanging overhead was a false one. But it was made with quite a lot of data, so it changed with the passage of time, and there was even an accurately arcing sun that rose and set. Was the reason that even this fake sky could take the weight off Momonga's chest and relax him because under all the graphics he was still human? Maybe also because it was programmed according to the particularities of a former guild member. He wished he could just stay and take it easy, but the situation didn't allow that. Momonga glanced around. They're not here. The twins should be managing this place, but... Just then, he felt someone looking at him. "Yeah!" At the same time the shout sounded, a figure hopped down from the VIP seating. That was the equivalent of 6 stories up, but the figure flipped in midair and made a feather-light landing. It wasn't due to magic, but simply great physical technique. Having absorbed the full shock of the landing by just bending its legs, the figure flashed a proud grin and made peace signs with both hands. "Victory!" It was a child of perhaps 10 who had jumped down. The most apt descriptor for that smile was radiant like the sun. She had that kind of androgynous cuteness only children have. Her golden hair reflected light in a way that made it look almost like she had a halo. Her eyes, bright like a puppy's, were 2 different colors, forest green and ocean blue. As a dark elf, a relative of the elf race, her ears were long and pointed, her skin tan. She wore fitted, dark red, dragon-scale light armor, top and bottom, over a layer of basic leather protective gear. On top of that, she sported a white vest with golden threading, featuring the crest of Ainzul Gone on the chest, and white pants to match. A big golden acorn hung from her neck. Her hands were protected by gloves with magic metal plates on the backs of the palms. Whips were bundled at her waist and right shoulder, and across her back she carried a bow with peculiar decorations on the grip, handle, and limbs. "Oh, it's Aura." Momonga murmured her name in recognition. Aura Bellafiora was one of the guardians of the 6th level, a beast-tamer ranger who could employ fantastical and magical creatures. She came running toward him with short steps that somehow carried her crazily fast, like an animal running flat out. She closed the distance in an instant and put the brakes on. Her sporty shoes, inlaid on top with scarletite, sent up a cloud of dust as they scraped along the ground. If she had calculated it out so that not a speck would reach Momonga, she'd done a brilliant job. "Phew!" She wiped her forehead even though she wasn't sweating and smiled like a puppy who wanted to play. Then she greeted Momonga in that ever so slightly too loud voice that only children have. "Welcome to the floor I guard, Lord Momonga." Compared to Selbes and Albedo, she was less deferential and more familiar, but that was actually more comfortable for Momonga. He didn't have much experience with all of this, so being overly revered only made it harder to know how to act. He wasn't getting any hostility from Aura's ear-to-ear grin, and Sense Enemy didn't pick up anything either. His emergency plan had been to attack with full power and promptly retreat, but it seemed like that would be unnecessary. "Thanks. I thought I'd come bother you for a bit." "What are you talking about? You are the master of the Great Tomb of Nazarick, its absolute ruler. No one would ever feel bothered to receive a visit from you, Lord Momonga." "Oh. By the way, I see that you're here, Aura, but..." As if taking a cue, Aura turned on her heel, glared up at the VIP seats, and shouted, "Hurry up! Come on! Lord Momonga is here! You're being rude!" Up in the darkness of the VIP seats, Momonga saw something bouncing up and down in a fidgety way. "Oh, Mare's over there, huh?"
"Yes, Lord Momonga, he is. He's such a wimp. Get down here!"
A weak little voice replied. In fact, it was a wonder they could even hear it, considering their distance from the VIP seats. But it was made possible by the magical necklace Aura had equipped.
Sis, there's no way."
Aura sighed, exasperated.
"Oh, Lord Momonga, he's just a bit of a coward. He's not being rude on purpose."
"Of course, I know that, Aura. I've never for a moment doubted your loyalty to me." Momonga nodded and gave a kind answer to put her at ease. Adults need to know their inner feelings as well as what their outward-facing stance would be. Sometimes it was necessary to tell a little lie. Aura seemed relieved, but a moment later she turned in anger to the figure up in the VIP seats.
"Our elite lord has graced us with his presence, and one of the floor guardians can't even come out to meet him? That's the worst, and you know it. If you don't have the courage to move your own butt, we're going to try it with my foot next." I'll take the stairs." "You mean you're going to keep Lord Momonga waiting even longer? Get over here already." "Oh, fine. Here goes."
It was a pretty pathetic little shout for someone who was trying to psych himself up, but he did hop down. Another dark elf. The difference between him and Aura was like night and day, but although he stumbled upon landing, it didn't seem like he'd taken any damage from the fall. He must have neutralized it with pure physical ability. Then he came running at a speed that matched the sound of his light footfalls. He was giving his all, naturally, but was still hopelessly slow compared to Aura. She must have been thinking the same thing, because her brow began to twitch.
"Hurry up!" I am."
The child who finally arrived looked just like Aura. Same hair color and length, same eye colors, same facial features. They couldn't be anything but twins. But if Aura was the sun, then Mare was the moon. He trembled as if expecting to be chewed out at any moment. Momonga was a bit surprised by both of them. The Mare he knew wasn't like this at all. Of course, NPCs generally just stood there rigidly with their fixed expressions. It didn't matter how long of a bio they were given. It was never reflected in their personalities. Yet here they were before him, two dark elves, with rapid-fire emotions. So this is how Teapot meant for them to be. Bubbling Teapot was the guild member who had set up Aura and Mare. He wished he could show them to her now.
"Sorry to keep you waiting, Lord Momonga."
Mare looked up at him nervously. The scales of his upper body dragon armor were more indigo than blue. He also wore a short mantle of dark green that almost exactly matched the leaves of the forest. Most of his clothes were white like Aura's, but he was wearing a skirt so short it left a little skin showing, only a little because of his white stockings. His acorn necklace looked just like Aura's, but silver. He wasn't as heavily armed as his sister. In his hands, which wore slender white gloves with a silky sheen, he clutched a gnarled staff of black wood, and that was it. Mare Bellofiore. He was the other guardian of the 6th level. Momonga smiled kindly, not that his empty eye sockets showed it, and took a good look at the two of them. Aura proudly puffed out her chest while Mare trembled under his gaze. Satisfied that they were indeed the crystallization of his guildmate's intentions, he nodded several times and then spoke. "More than anything, I'm just glad to see you're both doing well."
"Yeah, we're great. Just lately it's been so boring. It'd be nice if some raiders would come for a change." I don't want any raiders to come. They're scary."
Mare's words wiped the excitement off Aura's face, and she sighed.
"Sorry, Lord Momonga. Please excuse us. Mare, come with me a minute."
Momonga gave a slight nod, and Aura moved away a bit, dragging Mare by his pointy ears.
"Ow! Aura, that hurts."
Then she started hissing at him. Even at a distance, Momonga could tell she was giving him a scolding. "Raiders? I'm actually with Mare on that one.
At least I'd like them to wait until I get my feet on the ground, he thought as he watched the twins. The next thing he knew, Mare was sitting erect with his legs tucked under him and Aura stood before him, lecturing. The situation was reminiscent of the power struggle between the two of his former guildmates who were sisters, and he smiled wryly.
Jeez, but I don't think Perloroncino made Mare. Maybe Teapot had the idea that one should obey one's elder sister? Actually, now that I think of it, both Aura and Mare have died once before. I wonder what happened with that.
In the raid where 1,500 men attacked, the huge army got as far as the 8th level. In other words, Aura and Mare died attempting to hold the 6th level. But did they remember it? What does death mean for the two of them? In Yggdrasil, characters who died lost 5 levels and dropped one of their equipped items. That meant that characters level 5 or under were destroyed. Player characters were spared destruction by divine grace and stopped at level 1. Of course, that was speaking strictly of the rules of the game. In actuality, spells such as Resurrection and Raise Dead could ease the level penalty, and cash store items let players get off with just losing some experience points. In the case of an NPC, it was even simpler. The guild could revive a character with no penalty by paying a fee according to its level. Dying to lose levels ended up being a favorite way for people to rebuild their characters. Certainly in a game where an enormous amount of experience was required, losing even 1 level would be an extreme punishment. But in Yggdrasil, it was pretty easy to rack up levels until the upper 90s. The developers set it up so that losing levels wasn't such a terrifying thing. Their intent was not for people to be so scared of losing levels that they didn't want to explore, but for them to venture bravely into new territory. Under those rules, were these two who had died in the 1,500-man raid now different people? Or were they reincarnations of those exact characters? He did want to know, but he also felt like there wasn't any reason to wake sleeping dogs. That huge raid might have been a traumatizing experience for them. He also wondered if it was really necessary to prod so much to justify his own curiosity when Aura wasn't showing any hostility. After all, these were lovable NPCs that his guildmate made. He could talk to Aura about it after all the other pending matters had been taken care of. Plus, it was possible that the entire concept of death had changed entirely. In the real world, dying was the end, naturally. But what if that were different here? Momonga thought he'd like to experiment with it in the near future, but he couldn't determine how high a priority it should be until he had more information. It was probably best to just put it on the back burner for now. At this point, he didn't know how different this world was from Yggdrasil, so all he had was a great many questions. While he was pondering all of this, Aura had continued berating Mare. Momonga couldn't help but feel bad for him. He never said the kid deserved this much scolding. When the two sisters in his guild had fought, he had kept his mouth shut and just watched, but now he was different. How about we leave it at that? Lord Momonga! But Mare's not fulfilling his duties as a
I have no issue with his behavior. Aura, I understand very well how you feel, including your thinking that as a floor guardian, Mare shouldn't be so timid, especially around me. But should the great tomb of Nazarick be raided, I believe that both you and Mare will fight fearlessly in the face of death to protect it. If he'll do what needs to be done, and when the time comes, you don't need to scold him so much. Momonga, who had walked closer to them, grabbed Mare's arm and stood him up. And Mare, you should thank your big sister for being so kind. Even if I were upset, after seeing her chew you out like that, there'd be nothing I could do but forgive you. Mare's eyes widened, and he looked at his sister in surprise. Aura chimed in hastily.
Huh? No, that's not why I did it. I didn't think anything like that about you.
It doesn't matter, Aura. No matter what your intent was, your kindness came through. I just want you to know that I have no misgivings about Mare being a floor guardian.
Huh? Okay. Thank you, Lord Momonga. Thank you. He accepted their bows, but couldn't help but get the willies from the way their eyes lit up when they looked at him.
He'd pretty much never been looked at with such admiration, so he cleared his throat to hide both his hesitation and embarrassment. More importantly, Aura, I wanted to ask you about what you were mentioning before. You said you were bored when no one is raiding us?
Well, no, I mean...
From her backpedaling, Momonga could see he'd phrased his question badly. No, I'm not accusing you of anything. Please, tell me honestly.
Well, yes, it is a little boring. There isn't anyone strong enough to train with around here,
Aura answered, looking up at him, poking the tips of her index fingers together. As a guardian, Aura's level was, of course, 100. There were not so many level 100s in the dungeon, including Aura and Mare, 9 NPCs, plus one other. What about sparring with Mare? Mare had scrunched up as though he were trying to hide, and now a shudder went through his whole body. His eyes glistened as he shook his head no. He was terrified. Aura reacted with a sigh again. As she exhaled, a sickeningly sweet fragrance filled the air. It was different from Albedo's, a syrupy aroma that seemed to cling somehow. Recalling her powers, Momonga took a step back.
Oh, I'm sorry, Lord Momonga.
Realizing what had happened, Aura flapped her arms around to clear the air. One of Aura's passive skills as a beast tamer was the ability to use both buffs and debuffs at the same time. The effects drifted into the air on her breath and could have a radius of dozens of feet to 100 or more. Using an additional skill could make the range unbelievably huge. In Yggdrasil, buff and debuff icons would pop up so players understood clearly when they were in effect, but in their current situation, they problematically did not.
It's okay now. I turned it off.
Oh.
But Lord Momonga, you're undead, so psychic stuff shouldn't have any effect on you.
That's the way it had been in Yggdrasil. Psychic abilities had neither good nor bad effects on the undead. Was I in range just now? Aura scrunched up her shoulders in fear of the coming rebuke. Even Mare shrank a bit. I'm not angry, Aura, Momonga said as kindly as he could. Relax. Did you think you could affect me with a skill you weren't even using seriously? I'm just asking if I was in range or not.
Got it. You were in range.
From Aura's voice, filled with relief, Momonga realized how terrible and awe-inspiring he was to her. A prickling pressure assailed him under his clothes in the area where his stomach would have been if he'd had one.
What if I end up weaker because of this?
The thought of it made him want to run away at full speed. And what was the effect?
I think the one from just now was... yes, fear.
He didn't feel fear. In Yggdrasil, friendly fire had been disabled, so players couldn't harm members of their guild or other teammates. Here, however, there was a high possibility that that had changed. He knew it would be good to confirm one way or the other right away. I thought it used to be the case that your powers couldn't have any negative effects on people in the same group.
Huh?
Aura's blank expression was matched by Mare. Momonga gathered that it hadn't been the case. Must have been my imagination?
Yes, but I can control the range of the effects at will, so maybe that's how you misunderstood?
So friendly fire was on. The reason Mare hadn't been affected was probably because he was equipped with an item that could neutralize psychic effects. Meanwhile, Momonga's god items didn't have any psychic resistance data in them. So why hadn't he felt fear? He had two guesses. Basic resistance based on his ability points or psychic effects immunity due to a special undead ability. He decided to dig a little deeper, since he wasn't sure which one was correct. Can you try out some other effects for me? Aura cocked her head and made an odd questioning noise. She seemed like a puppy again, so Momonga reached out to pet her in spite of himself. Her smooth, silky hair was delightful to touch. When she didn't seem to mind, he wished he could just stay there, petting her forever. except Mare's glazed stare freaked him out, so he stopped.
I wonder what he's feeling.
After thinking for a moment, Momonga released his other hand's grip on the staff and stretched it out to pet Mare. Absent-mindedly thinking how the texture of Mare's hair seemed somehow better than Aura's, he petted the both of them until he was quite satisfied. Then he finally remembered what he'd gone there to do. Now then, I have a favor to ask. I'm testing out a lot of things at the moment, and I want your cooperation, Aura. At first, the two of them looked like they didn't really know what to do, but by the time he took his hands away, they seemed self-consciously happy and willing.
Okay, understood. Leave it to me, Lord Momonga,
Aura gleefully replied. She was enthusiastic to get going, but Momonga held her back. Before that, he grabbed the floating staff.
Okay, just like before.
As he had done when he used the ring's power, he focused his mind on the staff. Of its countless powers, the one Momonga chose was contained within one of its jewels, inside a god artifact, the Moon Orb.
Summon Moon Wolf!
As the summoning magic activated, 3 beasts oozed into existence out of nowhere. Nothing about this surprised Momonga, since that was how the animation had looked in Yggdrasil. The Moon Wolves were similar in appearance to Eurasian wolves, except they gave off a silvery light. Momonga could sense a strange connection between these monsters and himself that clearly indicated who was in charge.
Moon Wolves?
Aura asked, her voice implying confusion at why he would summon such a weak monster. Moonwolves were extremely fast, so they were often deployed as key units in sneak attacks. But they were only level 20, too weak for Momonga and Aura. But for their purposes right now, these were fine. Weaker was actually better. Yes, include me in the range of your breath, too.
What? Are you sure?
Aura didn't seem okay with it, so he insisted. It's fine. Things weren't operating completely like they had been in the game anymore, so he couldn't ignore the possibility that Aura's powers weren't working correctly. In order to rule it out, he needed to be hit with her power at the same time as the third party, hence the Moonwolves. Aura huffed and puffed for a little while, but Momonga didn't feel a thing. Partway through, he turned his back to her and relaxed his mind, but there was still no effect. The Moonwolves did seem affected, though, so her power must have been working. Therefore, it seemed Momonga was immune to psychic effects. In other words, in Yggdrasil, when subhumans and grotesques reached certain race levels, they gained specific racial abilities. Momonga, who had reached the elite race of Overlord, had the following monster powers. Create upper tier undead, 4 per day. Create middle tier undead, 12 per day. Create lower tier undead, 20 per day. Negative touch. Aura of Despair 5, insta-death. Negative guard, dark soul, raven black halo, immortal blessing, impure providence, black wisdom, evil language proficiency. Ability point damage 4, stabbing weapon resistance 5, cutting weapon resistance 5, greater repel resistance 3, greater physical damage immunity 3, greater magical damage immunity 3, chill, acid, electric attack immunity, magical vision boost, see-through. Add to that the abilities from his class level, boost insta-death magic, master of dark rites, immortal aura, make undead, control undead, fortify undead, etc. He also had the basic undead special abilities, critical hit immunity, psychic effect immunity, no hunger or thirst, poison, sickness, sleep paralysis, insta-death immunity, resistance to ghost magic, physical penalty resistance, breathe anywhere, ability point damage immunity, energy drain immunity, the ability to recover from negative energy, night vision, etc. Of course, he also had weaknesses. Justice, light, holy attack vulnerability 4, battering weapon vulnerability 4, holy justice area ability point penalty 2, double fire damage, etc. It seemed extremely likely that he still possessed both the basic undead abilities and the special abilities he had gained from leveling up. I see. That's good enough for now. I thank you, Aura. Any issues on your end?
No, everything's fine.
Okay. Return. The three moonwolves disappeared as if time were rewinding.
Lord Momonga, was that why you came to our floor today?
Aura asked, but Mare nodded that he was curious too. Oh, right. No, I thought I'd do some training today.
Training? You?
Aura's and Mare's eyes practically popped out of their heads. What was this most elite caster, the ruler of the great tomb of Nazarick, who dominated all manner of lesser beings, talking about? But Momonga had expected this. Yes. The tap of the staff on the ground accompanying his simple reply was enough for them to understand. Momonga was inwardly pleased that their reaction matched what he'd anticipated.
Is that, the legendary you-know-what? The most elite weapon only you can touch? What does she mean by legendary you-know-what? Momonga wondered, but it didn't seem to be anything bad given the sparkle in Mare's eyes.
That's right. This is the guild weapon we all created together, the staff of Ainzul Gon. He lifted it into the air, and it sparkled beautifully in the light. It was such a gorgeous display, it was almost as if the staff was showing off. Except it was still exuding that ominous black shimmer, so it was hard to see it as anything but evil. Momonga didn't have a body type that could burst with pride, so to speak, but the passion was clear in his voice. The jewels held in each of the 7 snakes' mouths are all god artifacts. Since the items are part of a series, collecting them all yields great power. Gathering them took serious effort and an immense amount of time. In fact, there were many times we thought to quit. How many mobs did we hunt for the drops? Furthermore, the power contained within even just the staff itself surpasses god tier and is on par with a world item. Most impressive of all is its automatic intercept.
I'm totally rambling.
It was only natural to want to brag. He'd crafted it with his guildmates, but since he'd never been able to take it anywhere, he'd never had the chance to show it off. That was no excuse to gush right now, though. He suppressed the urge to keep boasting.
It's pretty embarrassing, actually.
Well, yeah, that's about it.
Wow! That's amazing, Lord Momonga!
The sparkles in the kid's eyes made him want to break into a huge grin. Trying to keep a straight face, not that his expressions came through so well via his skull anyway, he continued speaking. Anyhow, I'd like to do some experiments. Can you get things ready for me?
Yes, sir. Understood. I'll begin preparations right away. And then, is it okay if we watch?
Sure, I don't mind. I'm the only one who can hold it, so you should at least have a look.
Yes!
Shouted Aura, bouncing around so cute and joyful. Mari couldn't hide how happy he was, either. His long ears were twitching.
Oh, man. Hey, dignified expression of mine, no slipping, Momonga told himself, mobilizing all his willpower.
Oh, and Aura, I've called all the floor guardians here. They should arrive in less than an hour.
Huh? Then we have to get ready to welcome the...
No, don't worry about that. You can just wait for them here.
If you say so. All the floor guardians? So Shaltir will be here too?
All the floor guardians.
Ah.
Her ears suddenly drooped. Mari seemed more or less okay. The backstory had Aura not getting along with Shaltir very well, but his case must have been different. How are they going to react? Momonga whispered under his breath. 2. A party of about 50 riders galloped across a grassy plain. All of them were equally brawny, but one stood out from all the rest. There was no word more fitting for him than robust. It was plain, even through his breastplate, that his whole body was covered in bulging muscles. He was in his 30s. Deep creases formed when he knit his tan brow. His black hair was neatly trimmed, and his black eyes gleamed with the sharpness of a dagger. The rider next to him spoke. "Captain, we've almost reached the first village on our patrol." "Yes, it seems that way, Vice-Captain." This was Gazef Stronov, pride of the Riestes kingdom and captain of its guard. The village had not yet appeared down his line of sight. Suppressing his impatience, Gazef maintained a steady speed. Though they weren't driving their horses to exhaustion, it had been quite a march from the royal capital to here. A hint of fatigue had taken up root in his core. Certainly the same could be said for the horses. It wouldn't do to burden them any further. "But I really hope it's nothing." The vice-captain spoke again. His voice betrayed his anxiety, and Gazef felt the same. The mission the king had given them was to find the Imperial Knights spotted near the kingdom's border and subdue them. Under normal circumstances, it would have been faster to send soldiers from the nearby city of Arantel, but the Empire's knights were strong and well outfitted. The gap between them and the kingdom's recruits was clear. The only soldiers in the kingdom that had a chance against the knights were the ones directly under Gazef. But it was foolish to leave everything up to them like this. Even just mobilizing some troops to guard the villages until Gazef and his men arrived would probably have been enough to stave off the enemy. There were plenty of other options as well. Just currently, they couldn't be taken. Gazef knew why, and it irritated him to no end. He did his best to relax his grip on the reins, but he couldn't extinguish the blaze of his inner emotions. "Captain, it's ridiculous for us to get out to the village and then begin the search. And since you brought all of us, couldn't we divide up the labor? Or better yet, we could hire some adventurers from Arantel and ask them to find the knights. Why are we doing it like this?" "Don't say that, Vice-Captain. Nothing good will come of everyone finding out there are Imperial Knights throwing their weight around inside the kingdom's borders." "Captain, there's no one to hear us now. I want you to tell me the truth." A faint smile played across the vice-captain's face, but it was the exact opposite of a kindly grin. "Are the nobles interfering?" The vice-captain practically spat the words, and Gazef didn't reply, because the answer was yes. "So the damned nobles plan to use the victims as pawns in their power struggle? And since this area is directly under the king's jurisdiction, I suppose they'll use any suffering as an excuse to make snide remarks." "Not all the nobles think that way." "I'm sure there are some who, like you say, think of the people. Like the Golden Princess. But how many? If the king could just take absolute power like the emperor next door, he could ignore the damned nobles and focus on the people." "If we force things, sides will be taken and the country will be split. Causing an internal conflict with an expansionist empire next door would be even worse for the people." "I know, but—" "Let's drop it for now." Leaving it at that, Gazef pursed his lips and turned his penetrating gaze forward. Black smoke rose from beyond a small hill up ahead, and not just one or two trails. There wasn't a man present who didn't know what that meant. Gazef clicked his tongue and kicked his spurs into his horse's flanks. The scene that flooded their vision when they crested the hill was what they had expected. The village had been burned to ashes. The scattered house wreckage still standing was like grave markers. Gazef gave orders in a steely voice. "Company, begin maneuvers. On the double!" The village was burned to the ground. Only the collapsed remains of houses still bore any resemblance to their former shape. Walking through the wreckage, everything smelled like charred ashes mixed with the stench of blood. Gazef's face was steady, no trace of emotion, but that itself showed most clearly what he must have been feeling. The same went for the vice-captain, walking beside him. Of the more than 100 villagers, only 6 had survived. The rest had been massacred, women and children alike, even infants. "Vice Captain, escort the survivors to Erantel."
"Please don't do this. That would be the most..."
"You're right. It's a foolish plan, but we can't just leave them here like this." Erantel was directly under the king's jurisdiction, and protecting these villages was his job. If they abandoned the survivors, it would be a terrible blow to the king, and it was easy to see that the nobles trying to corner him would make noise about it too. And more importantly...
"Please rethink this. We should retreat to Erantel for the time being and get ourselves in order."
"That's impossible."
"Captain, I'm sure you realize, but this must be a trap. The timing of the attack on the village lines up too well with our arrival at Erantel. They waited for us before committing this atrocity. I'd even venture to say that the fact that they didn't kill every last person means it can't be anything but a trap."
The survivors hadn't managed to escape the knights by running and hiding. The attackers just didn't kill them. Their aim was probably to force the military to divide their strength to protect them.
"Captain, you can't mean that you're going to chase them down, knowing full well it's a trap?"
"That was my intention."
"Are you serious? Captain, it's true that you're strong. I'm sure you could fight 100 knights and come out victorious. But the Empire has a caster. If that old man is with them, it's risky, even for you. You're not fully outfitted right now, so losing to the four wouldn't be out of the question either. So I'm begging you, please withdraw. No matter how many more villages fell, losing you would be a greater loss for the kingdom."
In response to Gazef's silence, the vice captain continued with pain in his voice.
"If you can't withdraw, then let's all leave the survivors and go after them."
"That is probably the wisest choice. But it would mean abandoning lives that could be saved. Do you really think they could make it if we left them here on their own?" The vice captain had no response. He knew the chances were slim. If they didn't provide an escort and take them somewhere safe, they'd be gone within a few days. Still, the vice captain said, he had to say,
"Captain, the most valuable life here is yours. We can't be worried what happens to the villagers."
Gazef knew it was killing the vice captain to say such things, and he was angry at himself for forcing the issue, but he still couldn't accept it. "I was born a commoner. You were too, right?"
"Yes, I aspired to the select because I looked up to you."
"You lived in a village, right?"
"Yes, that's why..."
"Death is like a next-door neighbor when you live in a village. It's not so rare for a monster to attack and kill people, right?"
"Right."
"Mere soldiers can't always handle a monster. If you don't have the money to hire a specialist in monster extermination, an adventurer, all you can do is lie low until it leaves."
"Right."
"So, didn't you ever hope that a noble would appear in your hour of need? That someone with power would come and save you?"
"It'd be a lie if I said I didn't, but no one ever came. At least, the nobles of the domain we belong to never gave us any financial help."
"So let's show them we're different. We're going to save the villagers." The vice captain's voice caught as he remembered his past. "Vice captain, let's show him that there are people out there who will risk their lives despite the danger, and that there are strong who will protect the weak." The men's eyes met and exchanged a multitude of emotions. Finally, the vice captain spoke, sounding tired but aiming to convey his passion.
"Then I'll take my men and go. I may be replaceable, but you're not."
"Don't be absurd. There's a better chance we make it back alive if I go too. We don't go to our deaths. We go to save the people." The vice captain's mouth worked for a moment, then closed.
"I'll choose who will escort the villagers to Erantel right away."
As the sky reddened, human shapes began to appear one after another on the grassy plain. There were 45 of them. The way they appeared out of nowhere was not due to camouflage, but magic. One glance was enough to tell that they were not mercenaries, travelers, or adventurers. They all looked the same, clad in armored clothing woven out of special metallic thread to prioritize mobility and defense. Due to magical fortification, however, these clothes had even greater defense and, in fact, were more effective than a full suit of armor. Their leather bags weren't very full, and didn't seem like the kind of thing someone on a journey would carry. That is, as long as they weren't also magic. The specially made belts around their waists held multiple potions, and the mantles draped across their backs radiated magical auras. Gathering enough magical items for all those people would have been no easy feat, either of coin or in terms of time and effort. Being so well equipped was proof that they had nation-level support behind them. Despite that, there was nothing on any of their gear displaying their rank or affiliation. In other words, they were an unlawful group with reason to hide. They looked toward the abandoned village. Gazing upon the ruins enveloped in the stench of burning and blood produced not a flicker of emotion in their eyes. They looked on coolly, as if it were a matter of course. "We let him get away, huh?" A low voice spoke with a hint of disappointment. "There was nothing we could do. Have our decoy continue attacking villages. We must lead the beast to its cage." The man's sharp gaze followed Gazef and the others as they headed away. "Tell me where the decoy should strike next." 3. Mamanga prepared to cast a spell, stretching his fingers out slowly toward a straw figure set up in a corner of the arena. The magic he specialized in was more about secondary effects, like insta-death, than simply dealing damage. For that reason, it didn't work so well on non-living targets. A situation like this called for straightforward damage-dealing magic, but he had chosen his class's ghost tree and beefed up his repertoire with those type of spells. As a result, in terms of damage dealt, he was a few tiers behind magic users who specialized in combat spells. Mamanga peeked at the children. Their eyes sparkled with curiosity. The anxiety of whether he could live up to their expectations or not weighed him down. Next, he stole a glance in a different direction, where there were two huge monsters. They stood 10 feet tall with inverted triangle figures. Muscles rippled over frames that were a combination of human and dragon. Covering the muscles were scales harder than steel. The monsters had dragon-like faces and tails thick as tree trunks. Despite the lack of wings, they looked very much like dragons standing upright. In their arms, thicker than a man's torso, they each held some kind of weapon, a sword, a shield, that was half as long as they were tall. They were dragonkin, employed by Aura via her beast tamer skills to keep the arena clean. They were only level 55 and had no special abilities to speak of, but the punches they could dish with their strong arms paired with their seemingly inexhaustible health meant they could hold their own against higher-level monsters. Breathing a little quickly, Mamanga turned back to the straw figure. "Honestly, having everyone watching with such high expectations is putting me on the spot." The point of this exercise was to check if he could even use a spell or not. The reason he'd allowed Aura and Mare to watch was so he could show them his power before the others arrived and teach him how foolish it would be to oppose him. Of course, it was impossible for him to imagine these children betraying him, and there was certainly no sign that they might do such a thing, but Mamanga wasn't confident they would remain loyal to him if it turned out he had just lost the ability to cast spells. Aura interacted with him as if they were old acquaintances, but from Mamanga's perspective they might as well have met for the first time. Of course, her background was all based on ideas from the guild, and both of the children were guild member-created treasures. But it wasn't as if all their behavioral patterns, their responses to any situation, were set in stone. There was definitely what Mamanga supposed could be called a loophole in their settings. If they were intelligent living things that thought and behaved autonomously, they would eventually come across a situation that their bios did not prepare them for. And how would things turn out if there was nothing in there about devoting themselves to their master even if he was weak? Actually, there were probably more cases where loyalty was not specified at all, in which case, obeying orders or not all came down to individual judgment. If disobeying was as far as it went, that was fine. But what if someone wanted to rebel against the guildmaster if they thought he wasn't cutting it? Being more skeptical than necessary was a problem, but it was also stupid to blindly trust them. I'll just have to feel it out as I go. That was what made the most sense to Momonga under the circumstances. His other aim in having the twins there was to get advice in the event he couldn't cast a spell. They thought he was there to test the staff. He already knew magic items worked, so he could wield as much deception as necessary. My plan is perfect. He patted himself on the back and wondered if he had always been so sharp and composed. But there was no one who could answer that question for him. Momonga cleared the doubts from his mind and considered the magic he'd be able to use in Yggdrasil. The total number of magic spells in Yggdrasil, from tiers 1 to 10, plus super tier, was well over 6,000. These were split into various trees, but of the total, Momonga could use 718. Normally, a level 100 player could use about 300, so that was an insane amount. Not only that, but he'd memorized them all so he could choose the most appropriate spell for every situation, including this one. First, since friendly fire was on, he had to know what the area of effect would look like. So he would have to select a spell not based on how many enemies, but based on the area. And if this is my target, then... In Yggdrasil, all he'd had to do to cast a spell was tap an icon, but he couldn't do that anymore, so he had to find another way. He thought he might already have it partially mastered. He focused on the powers deep inside him, just as he had when he turned off negative touch. Just imagine there are icons floating in the air. He laughed to himself. I got it! He had a perfect grasp of what the area of effect would be and how much time it would take before he could cast again. The confidence in his ability came with a serious high, the fulfillment and satisfaction of knowing that his magic was truly his own power. He'd never felt like this in Yggdrasil. As if transmuting the delight that had bubbled up inside him, his swiftly calming mind intensified the high. He gathered it all at his fingertips and spoke the word of power. Fireball! A ball of flames grew from the tip of his finger, shot off at the straw figure he was pointing at, and hit just where he'd aimed. The ball burst on impact, instantly scattering the flames it had contained. The expanded flames raged through the area, even scorching the ground in a flash. The whole thing had only taken a second. Nothing was left of the straw figure but burned-up remains. Momonga let slip a laugh only he knew the meaning of, and the twins looked on, puzzled. Aura, ready another straw figure.
Oh, yes, sir. Right away. Hurry and set it up.
One of the dragonkin stood a new figure next to the charred one. Momonga walked leisurely over, turned toward the straw figure, and cast a spell. Napalm. It went slightly astray, but suddenly formed a column of flames that then engulfed the area and swirled up into the sky. After a beat, Momonga cast another spell at the figure that had been reduced to debris. Fireball! The figure was obliterated on impact. The spell's cooldowns were the same as in Yggdrasil. Actually, since for an area of effect spell he didn't have to first select the spell and then aim by moving the cursor showing the area, he might have been able to cast even faster. Perfect. His satisfaction took the form of this remark, voiced of its own accord.
Lord Momonga, should I prepare some more straw figures?
Aura did seem puzzled. She knew from before that Momonga possessed incredible power, so she probably didn't understand what was such a big deal about stunts like this. But that was exactly the impression he'd wanted to make on the twins, so their confused expressions were proof of his success. No, that won't be necessary. I want to test something else now. Once he'd declined Aura's request, he set about his next objective. Message. First, he would try to contact a GM. The way the message spell worked in Yggdrasil was that if the player being contacted were in the game at the time, the caller would hear a cell phone-like ring, but if they weren't, it would just disconnect. Now it was maybe a cousin of that spell. Momonga felt like he was putting out a feeler to search for something. The sensation was difficult to describe, and he was experiencing it for the first time in his life. It continued for a little while, and then, with nothing to connect to, the spell timed out. Well, that's discouraging. He repeated the same spell, this time not aimed at a GM. He was calling the old members of Ainzul Gon. He attempted it with 1% hope, feeling 99% like nothing would come of it, and as expected, there was no response. After calling all 40 members and confirming no response from anyone, he slowly shook his head. He'd known it was hopeless, but getting slapped in the face with reality was quite a downer. He cast the spell once more at Sebas. It connected! So it was clear that message was indeed, alas, working. There was still the possibility that it would only connect to characters in this world, but... Lord Momonga. The deeply deferential voice echoed in his head. Momonga wondered if Sebas was bowing on the other end like a businessman in the real world would have been. Sebas must have been unsure how to interpret the silence caused by Momonga's extraneous musing, because he spoke again, sounding perplexed. Is something wrong? Oh, sorry. It seems I spaced out for a moment. By the way, what's it like out there? We're on a grassy plain, and I haven't been able to confirm the existence of any intelligent life. A grassy plain. No bogs? The Great Tomb of Nazarick used to be located deep in a swamp inhabited by frog-like people known as Tvikes. The whole area was covered by mist, and there were poisonous bogs here and there. No, just a grassy plain. Momonga laughed in spite of himself. Who knows what the heck is going on now? So Nazarick as a whole has been teleported to some unknown location? Sebas, is there anything up in the sky? Any signs or signals? No, nothing like that. Just the same night sky as the 6th level. What? A night sky, huh? There's nothing else in the area that catches your eye? No, not in particular. Aside from the Great Tomb of Nazarick, I don't even see any man-made structures. I see. What could he say? The only thing left for him to do was rip his hair out, although somewhere in his mind he had been prepared for this possibility. Sebas's silence indicated he was awaiting direction. Momonga glanced at the band on his left wrist. There were about 20 minutes until the other guardians would arrive, in which case there was only one order that made sense to give. Be back in 20 minutes. Once you've returned to the tomb, come to the amphitheatrum. I'm assembling all the guardians, so I'll have you report what you've seen. Understood. Okay, get as much information as you can before then. After getting Sebas's confirmation, he ended the spell. Just as he was thinking he'd take a break, having finished everything he needed to do for the moment, he remembered the 2 children and their expectant gazes. He needed to show them the power of the Staff of Ainzul Gon, since he'd said he would. He took the staff into his hand, but couldn't decide what magic to unleash. It was as if all its countless powers were begging to be used. I should probably go for something pretty showy. So he chose the Fire Orb, and from among its powers, cast Summon Primal Fire Elemental. Obeying Momonga's will, power stirred within a jewel in one of the snake's mouths. Sensing that the flow of power was adequate, he pointed the staff. A huge sphere of light grew at the end, and an incredible storm of flames whipped up around it. The vortex rapidly expanded to a diameter of 13 feet and a height of about 20 feet. The crimson purgatory kicked up a hot wind, and out of the corner of his eye, Momonga saw the dragonkin move in front of Aura and Mare to protect them. His robe flapped in the waves of heat. It could have easily burned him, given the temperature, but Momonga had compensated for the weakness to fire he shared with all undead with perfect resistance, so he was unaffected. After increasing its size by consuming all the air in its vicinity, the swaying tornado of flames emitted a glow like fusing iron and took on a humanoid shape. The primal fire elemental was one of the highest level elementals, falling in the upper 80s range. Momonga felt the same connection with it that he had had with the moonwolves. "Wow!" A gasp escaped Aura's lips as she marveled at the monster. It was impossible to call forth such an elite elemental with regular summoning magic, and the look on her face was like a kid who'd gotten the toy she'd always wanted.
"Want to try fighting it?"
"Huh? What?"
She was lost for a moment, but then the natural smile of a child played across her face. Actually, for a child, it was a bit, rather, twisted. Mare's expression was more childlike.
"You'll let us fight it?"
"Sure, I don't mind. It's no big deal if it gets defeated."
Momonga shrugged. The staff's power allowed him to summon one a day. In other words, it didn't matter if this one got taken down, because he could just summon another one the next day.
I just remembered something I have to do. Mare!
She grabbed him with an iron grip when he tried to make a run for it. Apparently, she wasn't going to let him escape. She snagged him with her smile. To Momonga, it was the smile of an adorable little girl, but he wondered if it looked different to someone with the same face. Mare was scared stiff. Aura dragged him in front of the primal fire elemental. His eyes darted around seeking succor, finally finding Momonga. In reply to his radiant ear-to-ear grin, Momonga joined his palms to mimic a prayer. The light on Mare's face went out.
"Well, don't overdo it, you two. It'd be silly to get hurt."
"We won't,"
Aura responded cheerfully. Mare's voice was there too, but gloomy, like he was being escorted to his doom. Momonga figured they wouldn't get hurt as long as Mare was there, so he used his connection to the primal fire elemental to order it to attack. The twins engaged the roaring flames of the attacking elemental with Aura forward and Mare in back. Aura double-wielded her whips to lash the hovering monster into submission, and Mare's magic steadily racked up damage.
"Yeah, I figured this would be no problem for them."
The battle may have been one-sided, but he continued to watch while he went over in his head the other things he had to investigate. He had already confirmed that magic and some items worked, but there were still other items he wanted to check. Most importantly, scrolls, staves, and wands. Objects like these contained magic. Scrolls were single-use, while staves and wands came with a certain amount of casts. Momonga possessed quite a few of these. He was the type that felt using up consumables was a waste. He refused to use the highest grade recovery potions, even on the final boss. He'd gone beyond cautious to plain stingy, so his inventory had just piled up. In Yggdrasil, they'd been stored in his item box, but where were they now? Recalling how he used to open his item box, he stretched his fleshless hand into the air. He felt it slip into something. It was almost like breaking the surface tension of water. He was sure, for an onlooker, it must have looked like part of his arm had disappeared into the air. Then, as if he were opening a window, he made a broad sliding motion to the side. A window did open, right in the air, and inside were several staves lined up all neat and tidy. This was definitely Yggdrasil's item box. He moved his hand to scroll through what he supposed one could call his inventory screen. Scrolls, wands, weapons, armor, decorations, jewels, potions, and other consumables. He had a vast number of magical tools. Momonga's face broke into a relieved smile. With all this, I should be able to protect myself even if everyone in the tomb turns against me. Still absent-mindedly keeping his eye on Aura and Mare's fierce battle, Momonga summarized all the information he'd collected so far.
Are the NPCs I've met programs?
No, they were beings with consciousness, just like humans. It was impossible to capture such subtle emotions with code. He needed to assume that they were no longer programs, but had somehow become equivalent to humans.
And what is this world?
That was unclear. Considering Yggdrasil's magic existed, it would be valid to suppose he was inside the game. But taking into account the previous answer, that couldn't possibly be the case. That said, it was either the game world or some other world, one of the two. Not that either made any sense.
How should I conduct myself?
He'd confirmed that he could use his powers as he could in Yggdrasil, so if all the NPCs and monsters in the Great Tomb of Nazarick were also based on Yggdrasil data, he would have no enemies. The problem would be if there were something not from Yggdrasil. But all he could do was cross that bridge when he came to it. For now, he had to just act with the dignity of a ruler, assuming he could muster such a thing.
What's the plan?
Work to gather information. He didn't know what this world was, and at the moment, he was like an ignorant tourist. He needed to keep his wits about him and cautiously gather as much information as he could.
Say this is some other world. Should I try to get back to mine?
Good question. If he'd had any friends, he'd probably try to go back. If his parents were still alive, he'd risk his life to find a way back. If he'd had a family to take care of, or a lover... But he had none of those things. He went into the office, worked, came home, and slept. Up until now, he'd log into Yggdrasil and keep things ready in case any of his guildmates wanted to come back. But he didn't even have that anymore. Was there any point in going back to such a world? But if he could get back, then he knew he should put in the effort. One could never have too many options. The world outside the tomb could very well be hell. Okay, what do I do? Momonga's lonely words to himself evaporated into the air. The primal fire elemental's gigantic body disappeared as if melting into the air, and the heat that had been thrown around the area rapidly dissipated. Momonga also felt the bond of dominance he'd been vaguely aware of break. The primal fire elemental had extraordinary destructive power and stamina, but for Aura, who demonstrated impressive evasive action and had complete immunity to fire damage that had been hitting everything in the area, it might as well have been target practice. Of course, if she had gotten hit, she would have lost a significant portion of her health, but Mare, as a druid, would never let that happen. He used an appropriate mix of buffs and debuffs to support her. Their style of fighting was a magnificent division of roles between forward and rear positions. Momonga was struck both by that and by how raw the action had felt. It had been a real fight, not something from a game.
Magnificent. You were both wonderful.
The children smiled at his heartfelt words of admiration.
Thank you, Lord Momonga. It's been a while since we've gotten such a workout.
The two of them casually wiped the sweat from their faces, but the moment they did, it beaded up again and began to drip down their tan skin. Momonga silently opened his item box and took something out for the first time in this world, the bottomless pitcher of water. Yggdrasil had systems for eating and thirst, etc., but since Momonga was undead, none of them applied to him, so he had never used the item himself. He had been using it for his mounts. The pitcher was made out of a transparent material that seemed like glass and was filled to the brim with fresh water. Perhaps due to how cold the water was, countless droplets had condensed on the outside of the container. Next, he took out 2 clean glasses, filled them, and offered them to the twins.
Aura, Mare, please drink this.
What? We couldn't possibly, Lord Momonga. Yeah, we don't need to trouble you for that. I can make water with my magic.
Aura waved her hands in polite refusal, and Mare shook his head quickly back and forth. Seeing them like that made Momonga wince.
Oh, come on. It's just water. Just a small token of my thanks for all your hard work.
Ah. Oh.
Aura and Mare, blushing, nervously reached out their hands to take the glasses.
Thank you, Lord Momonga. I can't believe you're pouring drinks for us.
Does it really make you that happy? This time, Aura didn't refuse, but took the glass in both hands and gulped it down. The movements of her throat were clearly visible, and the water that overflowed from the corners of her lips ran down her lustrous neck and disappeared into her chest. Mare, meanwhile, held the cup in one hand and took measured sips. The difference in their personalities was made abruptly apparent just from the way they drank. Watching them, Momonga brought a hand to his own throat. It felt like there was a membrane stretched directly over his cervical spine. He hadn't felt thirsty since entering this body, or tired. He understood that it was only natural for an undead not to feel any of those things, but the idea of not being human anymore seemed like it had to be a joke. He felt around his body some more. Skin, flesh, blood vessels, nerves, organs. He was missing all manner of things. He had a body made solely of bone. He'd known that, but now he groped around so it would sink in. His sense of touch was slightly dull compared to when he was human, almost like there was a thin cloth between him and anything he went to touch. Meanwhile, his other senses performed outstandingly. His hearing and vision were extremely sharp. Since his body was built entirely of bones, it seemed like it could break at any moment, but he also had the sense that each bone was more solid than steel. Although this body was completely different from his old one, there was a strange satisfaction and sense of fulfillment knowing it was his. Perhaps that was why he wasn't frightened by his transformation. "Want another glass?" He held up the bottomless pitcher and offered once the children had finished their water.
Nope. That was enough for me.
I see. Mare, how about you?
Oh, I'm okay. My throat's not dry anymore.
Momonga nodded, took the glasses back, and put them away into the air.
I thought you were more scary, Lord Momonga,
Aura said softly.
Oh, really? I can be scarier if you like.
No, I like you like this. Way better.
Then I'll stay like this.
Aura's animated response had thrown him off a bit.
You're not this nice only to us, are you?
Momonga didn't know how to respond to her quiet murmurs, so he just patted her on the head several times. She was like a puppy presented with its favorite food. Mari looked on jealously. Suddenly they heard a voice.
Oh, am I the first?
It sounded younger than one might expect from the tone. At the same time, a shadow spread across the ground, rose up out of it, and took the shape of a door. Then someone walked slowly through. Her whole body was wrapped in a soft-looking raven-black ball gown with a full, wide skirt. She covered up on top with a bolero cardigan featuring frills and ribbons. Add to all that her fingerless lace gloves, and almost all her skin was hidden from view. Only her shapely face, unparalleled was the right word to describe it, was visible, its almost waxy white skin exposed. Her long silver hair was gathered to one side and up so not a strand of it fell in her face. Her crimson eyes had a weirdly jubilant look in them. She was 14, or possibly younger. There was still some child in her, and her beauty was born of that mix of cuteness and adult attractiveness. One thing that was out of balance, however, was how big her chest was for her age.
Teleportation is restricted in Nazarick for a reason. Don't just go using a gate. You entered the arena the normal way, so couldn't you have just kept walking, Shaltir?
An exasperated voice sounded right next to Momonga. The icy tone had nothing of the puppyishness of just a moment ago. On the contrary, it was full to overflowing with hostility. Next to Aura, Mare began trembling again. It was probably wise of him to be inching away from his sister. Even Momonga was a bit alarmed by the sudden change in her. The girl, Shaltir, who had arrived using the highest level of teleportation magic, cast not so much as a glance at Aura, but stood squirming a bit before Momonga. She smelled pleasantly like perfume.
You reek,
Aura muttered softly. adding that maybe her undead body rotting was to blame. Perhaps because she had caught Momonga instinctively lifting his arm to check if he smelled, a dark blue vein stood up on Shaltir's forehead.
Oh, come now. You can't say that. Lord Momonga is undead too. Huh? What are you talking about? Lord Momonga is not regular undead. Pretty sure he's like super undead or godly undead or something.
Hearing Shaltir and Mare express their satisfaction with such an explanation.
Oh, right.
Momonga felt somewhat insignificant.
I don't know what it's like here, but at least in Yggdrasil I was just plain undead.
More to the point, super undead and godly undead didn't exist.
Still, what you said was kind of bad. You think so? Okay, then take two. Ahem. Maybe it's because of your rotting dead flesh. Yes, I suppose that will do.
Accepting Aura's second take, Shaltir slipped her arms around Momonga's neck to embrace him.
Ah, my master, the sole being I cannot conquer.
Her wet tongue showed itself between her parted red lips. It moved over them as if it were its own separate animal. From her open mouth came sweet-smelling breath. All of this would have been extremely becoming of a bewitchingly beautiful adult, but at her age something was off. The awkward mismatch was even a bit endearing. In the first place, she wasn't tall enough, so instead of embracing him, it just seemed like she was trying to hang from his neck. Despite all that, Momonga was unaccustomed to attention from women and was plenty bewitched. He nearly took a step backward, but made up his mind to stand still.
Was her personality always like this?
He couldn't get the question out of his mind. But since the one who wrote her backstory was Pereroncino, it was entirely possible that this was just how she was. That guy loved porn games more than anything, and had even adopted "Porn games are my life" as his personal catchphrase. And that good-for-nothing had written the bio of Shaltir Bloodfallen. She was the guardian of levels 1 through 3 and a true vampire, as well as a little girl who'd been given a pile of X-rated video game character traits.
I think that's enough.
Shaltir responded to the low, hard voice and sneered at Aura.
Oh, hello, Squirt. I didn't see you there.
Momonga didn't feel like bothering to point out that they'd just been talking a moment ago. Ignoring Aura and her twitching, irritated expression, Shaltir addressed Mare.
It must be hard for you to have such an odd elder sister. You should get some distance from her as soon as possible. If you don't, you might end up the same way.
Mare's face went sickly pale. He knew she was using him to pick a fight with his sister. But Aura smiled.
Shut up, Miss Fake Boobs.
She'd dropped a bomb.
How'd you know?
Oh, she broke character, Momonga said to himself.
There was no sign of her forced, elegant cool.
One glance is enough to tell. Look how bizarrely poofy they are. How many layers of padding did you use? Wah, wah!
Shaltir flailed her hands as if to erase the words out of the air. Now she looked her age. Meanwhile, Aura had an evil grin on her face.
If you use that much padding, I bet they must shift around when you run, huh? Eek!
Shaltir emitted a strange scream now that she was caught.
Bullseye! Your boobs slipped, so that's why you used a gate. So you could get here in a hurry without having to run. Shut it, Pipsqueak. You don't have any. I at least have I'm pretty big.
Shaltir frantically fired back, but Aura only grinned even more evilly. Shaltir took a step back as if she'd been shoved. The fact that she was trying to inconspicuously shield her chest was kind of sad.
I'm still only 76. I've got plenty of time ahead of me. It must be tough being undead, with no future. You don't grow. Ugh.
Shaltir groaned and retreated farther. She had no comeback for that, and it showed plainly on her face. Aura noted this and stretched her slit-like grin even farther.
You should be satisfied with what you've got. Now that you've said that, you can't take it back.
Shaltir's gloved hands began to exude a shimmering black haze. Aura had her whips ready to intercept. Before the two of them stood a flustered Mare. Momonga felt like he was watching a scene from the past and couldn't decide whether to stop them or not. Perodoncino, who had created Shaltir, and Bubbling Teapot, who had created Aura and Mare, were brother and sister. They used to have good-natured squabbles sometimes, like this. Momonga almost felt he could see the shadows of his former guildmates fighting behind the two NPCs.
What a racket!
Momonga was basking in reminiscences of his old guildmates when the hard, twisted voice of something not human, speaking human words, stopped Aura and Shaltir's quarrel short. Standing in the direction from which the voice came, who knew how long he'd been there, was a grotesque, throwing a chill into the air. He looked like an 8-foot-tall bipedal insect. If there were such a thing as a combination of an utterly demonic mantis and an ant, it'd probably look like this. From his sturdy tail that was double his height and the rest of his body sprouted countless icicle-like spikes. His horizontally closing lower jaws were surely powerful enough to sever a human arm with no trouble. 2 of his arms carried a silver halberd, and the other 2 held a horrifying yet excellently made mace giving off a sinister black aura and a broadsword so warped it seemed impossible for it to ever be sheathed. He was wrapped in a chill that sparkled like diamond dust, and his light blue exoskeleton was like armor. His back and shoulders bulged like icebergs. This was the guardian of the 5th level, sovereign of the frozen river, Cocytus. He struck the ground with the blade of his halberd, and the earth around it slowly froze.
You amuse yourselves too much before a supreme being.
She's being disrespectful to... I'm just telling the truth.
Mare panicked as Shaltir and Aura glared at each other again, eyes fearsomely flashing. Momonga was over it all by now and warned them both in a voice that he made deep on purpose.
Shaltir, Aura, that's enough playing around for now.
Both of them jumped and then hung their heads in unison.
I'm sorry.
He nodded to generously accept their apology, and then turned to the newly arrived figure.
Thanks for coming, Cocytus. I come immediately when you call, Supreme One.
White breath escaped from between Cocytus's mandibles, and in response came a cracking noise as if the moisture in the air were freezing solid. It was a cold on par with the heat of the primal fire elemental. Just being near him was enough to cause all sorts of low-temperature status effects and physical damage, but Momonga didn't feel a thing. There was no one in the room who didn't have some way to resist fire, chill, and acid attacks.
Have you been bored with no raiders these days? There certainly hasn't been much going on.
His mandibles clicked. It sounded like the threatening clicks of an angry hornet, but Momonga chose to think he must be laughing.
But that said, I have things to do, so I can't say I've been bored. Oh, things to do. Do you mind telling me what? Training, so that I may be of use to you at any time.
Cocytus, not that it was apparent from the way he looked, was a warrior, both personality-wise and by design. Of those in the Great Tomb of Nazarick who used weapons, he had the highest attack power.
To be of use to me? Thanks. Hearing that single word makes it all worth it. Oh, it seems Demiurge and Albedo have arrived.
Following Cocytus's line of sight, Momonga saw 2 shadows near the entrance of the arena. Albedo was in front. A man followed behind her as if in attendance. When they'd gotten closer, Albedo smiled and bowed deeply to Momonga. The man also gave an elegant bow before speaking. "Sorry to keep you all waiting." He was about 6 feet tall with skin the shade of a suntan. He had Asian features and his jet-black hair was slicked back. The eyes behind his round glasses were not so much slivers as closed. He wore a 3-piece suit with a necktie and had the air of a shrewd businessman or lawyer. Even though he presented himself as a gentleman, he couldn't hide his evil nature. Behind him stretched a silver-plated tail with 6 spines on the tip. This man, scattering dark, flickering flames, was creator of the Inferno, Demiurge. He was the demon who commanded NPC defense operations and the guardian of the 7th level.
This is everyone, then?
Lord Momonga, it seems we're still missing 2.
It was a voice that wormed its way into hearts and drew one in with its richness. All Demiurge's words came with a passive skill called Incantation of Influence. It was a power that caused the weak-hearted who heard him to instantly become his puppets. That said, no one in the room was affected. It only worked on targets of level 40 and below, so all those present merely heard it as a particularly luscious voice, and nothing more.
Their presence isn't necessary. They've both been assigned to prioritize other tasks. We don't need to interrupt them for this.
If that's all right, then...
It seems my comrade is not here either.
Aura and Shaltir stopped short. Even Albedo's smile froze.
He's only a guard for one part of one of my floors. Yeah.
Shaltir forced a smile, and Aura chimed in while Albedo nodded.
Ah, the Prince of Fear. Well, we should probably notify the Domain Guardians as well. Please pass the information along to Crimson, Grant, and the others. I'll leave it up to each floor guardian.
There were 2 types of guardians in the Great Tomb of Nazarick. One was the type that all those before Momonga now were, floor guardians who were each in charge of 1 or more levels. The other was domain guardians who guarded part of a level. Put simply, domain guardians worked under the floor guardians to protect one section of a level. Since there were so many of them, they were somewhat underappreciated, and in Nazarick the word guardian generally indicated a floor guardian. Once everyone had indicated their understanding of Momonga's order, Albedo spoke.
Now then, let us perform the ritual of allegiance.
The guardians all nodded, and before Momonga could get a word in, they'd arranged themselves with Albedo in front and the other guardians lined up behind her. Their expressions were all stiffly ceremonious. Any hint of a jokey atmosphere had vanished. Shaltir, at the end of the line, took a step forward.
Guardian of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd levels, Shaltir Bloodfallen, I bow before you, O Supreme One.
She dropped to one knee and put a hand over her chest, bowing her head low. After Shaltir, Cocytus stepped forward.
Guardian of the 5th level, Cocytus, I bow before you, O Supreme One.
He took the same humble posture as Shaltir and bowed to Momonga. Next, the 2 dark elves stepped forward.
Guardian of the 6th level, Aura Bellafiora, I bow before you, O Supreme One. Guardian of the same, Mare Bello Fiore, I bow before you, O Supreme One.
As expected, they also got down on one knee and bowed their heads low. Shaltir, Cocytus, Aura, Mare. They were built differently, so there should have been some discrepancy in the size of their steps, but their kneeling positions formed a straight line. Then Demiurge took a graceful step forward.
Guardian of the 7th level, Demiurge, I bow before you, O Supreme One.
Though his tone was cool, he made an extremely heartfelt bow without breaking his elegant demeanor. Finally, Albedo stepped forward.
Captain of the Floor Guardians, Albedo, I bow before you, O Supreme One.
Smiling faintly at Momonga, she kneeled in the manner of the other guardians. But for Albedo, that wasn't the end. With her head bowed, she made her voice carry and gave her last report.
Accepting Guardian of the 4th level, Gargantua, and Guardian of the 8th level, Victim, the Floor Guardians have gathered to prostrate themselves before you. Your orders, O Supreme One, we offer our complete devotion to you.
Being faced with their 6 bowed heads was practically enough to make his gulp audible, despite a lack of anything to gulp with. The air was tense. Or maybe it was only Momonga who felt on edge.
I don't know what to do. Normal people probably never experience something like this even once in their lives.
In the confusion, he accidentally activated some of his skills and emitted an aura throughout the area. A halo also appeared behind him. Without even the composure to cancel them, he frantically fought to remember everything he'd seen in movies or on TV to get an idea of how to conduct himself. Raise your heads. All of their heads rose together in so crisp a motion that he practically expected to hear a whoosh. It was so simultaneous that he wondered if they'd been practicing. Well then, for starters, I appreciate you all gathering here.
Please save your appreciation. We offer you not only our devotion, but our very selves. It is most natural that we should heed your call.
None of the other guardians tried to cut in. As captain, Albedo was truly their unified voice. Seeing all their earnest expressions turned his way, Momonga felt a lump in the throat he didn't even have. The pressure to behave like a ruler was weighing him down. But that wasn't all. His orders would determine their future. He started to feel indecisive. The worry that the great tomb of Nazareth might collapse due to a decision he made flitted across his mind.
Lord Momonga, you seem irresolute. That is only natural. You must wonder whether it is even worth accepting our help.
Her smile had vanished, and a determined look tensed her features.
However, if you honor us with your orders, we, the Floor Guardians, will suffer any trials to carry them out with all our bodies and souls. We vow to serve in such a way as will bring no shame upon our creators, the 41 supreme beings of Ainzul Gone. We vow it!
The other Floor Guardians echoed Albedo in chorus. Their voices were filled with an unstoppable power. Their loyalty was like a priceless diamond sneering at Momonga for worrying they might betray him. It was as if the darkness before his eyes had vanished in the morning light. And a shiver went through him. He realized how wonderful the NPCs his guildmates had made really were. The radiance of Ainzul Gone's glory days were here now. He was so happy to have the fruit of his guildmates' labor with him that his dignified expression broke. Of course, there were no major changes to his bony face, but the beautiful red spark in his eyes burned more brightly. With no trace of his former anxiety, Momonga spoke smoothly, like the guildmaster he was. Wonderful, Guardians. It is my firm belief as of this moment that you can understand my aims and are capable of accomplishing them without error. He surveyed their faces once more. Now then, there may be some points that are unclear, but I want you to listen carefully. It appears the great tomb of Nazareth has unexpectedly become involved in some sort of situation, and it's unclear how it happened. The Floor Guardians' serious expressions didn't flinch. The cause is unclear, but we know for sure that the tomb has been teleported out of the swamps and into a grassy plain. Is there anyone who saw any signs this might happen? Albedo gazed over her shoulder at the faces of each Floor Guardian. After reading their expressions, she said, "No, my apologies, but no one had any idea this would happen." Then I'd next like to hear from each Floor Guardian. Did anything strange happen on your levels recently? Now they spoke up individually for the first time.
Nothing strange happened in the 7th level. Nor in the 6th. Like my sister said.
The same goes for 5.
Nothing strange happened in the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd levels. Lord Momonga, I would like to investigate the 4th and 8th levels immediately.
Very well. I'll leave that up to you, Albedo. But take care in the 8th level. If something happened there, it's possible you may not be able to deal with it.
After Albedo deeply bowed in acknowledgement, Shaltier spoke.
Then I'll investigate the surface.
Oh, I already sent Sebas out to explore the surface.
Albedo had been there when he'd given the order, so she wasn't surprised, but the others couldn't hold their shock back from appearing on their faces. The Great Tomb of Nazareth had 4 NPCs with superior melee combat skills. Cocytus had the highest attack power when armed. Clad in heavy armor, Albedo had no equal when it came to guarding. Sebas was the best in a pure fight, and when he showed his true form, his total combat ability probably outstripped the previous two. Then there was one who outstripped all three of them. The Guardian's shock must have been at the fact that Momonga would send Sebas, who boasted no weaknesses and all manner of strengths in a head-on fight, out to do a task so simple as reconnaissance. They took this as a sign of how wary he was about the unusual situation they were in, and the reality of the crisis began to sink in for them too.
Well, it's about time to wrap up, but...
Momonga caught sight of Sebas jogging toward him. When he arrived, he slowly lowered himself to one knee like the others.
Lord Momonga, I apologize for my lateness. No matter. More importantly, what's it like out there?
Sebas looked up and cast a momentary glance at the Guardians.
This is an emergency. It's only natural that we should inform the floor Guardians.
Yes, my lord.
For a half-mile radius, it's all grassy plain. I could not confirm any man-made structures. I saw a number of small animals, as one might expect to be living in such a place, but there were no humanoids or large life forms. All the small animals monsters? No, the creatures did not appear to have any combat ability to speak of. Aha! And this grass. Is it the sharp, stiff type that stabs you as you walk through it? No, just plain meadow grass. There is nothing special about it. You didn't see any floating castles or anything? No, none. There was no sign of any man-made light in the sky or on the ground. I see. A starry sky, then. Nice work, Sebas.
Momonga expressed his appreciation, but felt a bit discouraged about how little information he'd been able to get. Still, now he more or less knew that they were not in the world of Yggdrasil, although there remained the question of how he could use this in-game equipment and cast spells like usual. It wasn't clear why they'd been teleported or where they'd ended up, but it seemed like they should raise Nazarik's alert level. They might be in someone else's territory. Suddenly taking up residence in someone else's territory, without permission, would surely invite anger. They'd be lucky if anger was as far as it went.
Guardians, first, raise the alert level by 1 on each floor. There are too many unknowns right now, so don't let your guard down. Take any raiders alive. Capturing them without injury would be ideal. It goes without saying, but we don't want to complicate things while we're in this uncertain situation.
Everyone bowed together in understanding.
Next, I'd like to hear about how things operate here. Albedo, how do you share security information among floors?
In Yggdrasil, they'd just been NPCs operating according to their programs. There shouldn't have been any movement of information or mobs among floors.
The security of each level is left up to the individual Guardians, but we do have a system for sharing information, which Demiurge oversees.
Momonga was slightly surprised, but then nodded his head in satisfaction.
Splendid. Defense Operations Coordinator Demiurge and Floor Guardian Captain Albedo, I trust you to work toward a more perfect system.
Yes, my lord. To clarify, we can accept levels 8, 9, and 10 from the system?
Victim has 8 covered, so that one is fine. Actually, I'm making 8 off limits. I take back the order I gave you earlier, Albedo. As a general rule, only those with my express permission will be allowed to enter the 8th level. Undo the seal that prohibits direct travel between the 7th and 9th levels, and let's have the security system cover the 9th and 10th levels as well.
Is that all right with you?
Albedo's astonishment was plain on her face. Behind her, Demiurge's eyes opened wide, and he said what they were actually thinking.
You will permit lowly minions to enter the domain of the Supreme Ones? Is the situation so serious as that?
Minions were the monsters that members of Ainzul Gone did not create, the mobs that spawned automatically. Come to think of it, with very few exceptions, there were no minions in the 9th or 10th levels. Momonga wasn't sure what to say. Albedo seemed to think those areas were some kind of holy ground, but the truth couldn't have been further from that. The reason there were no mobs assigned to the 9th level was simply that by the time a group of raiders broke through the 8th level, where all the strongest monsters were, they figured they didn't have much chance of winning, so they decided they would just lurk in the throne room like proper villains.
I have no problem with it. This is an emergency, so let's up our guard.
Understood. I'll choose the very best, most noble minions for the job.
Momonga nodded and turned to look at the twins.
Is it possible to hide the great tomb of Nazarick somehow? I'm not sure if illusions alone will cut it, and thinking about the energy required to maintain something like that gives me a headache.
Aura and Mare put their heads together. After a moment, it was Mare who spoke.
It would be difficult to use magic if we need to hide all the parts that are above ground. Maybe if we covered the walls with dirt and grew plants out of it? You intend to soil the walls of glorious Nazarick?
Albedo addressed Mare over her back. Her tone was sweet and gentle, but the emotions contained were confrontational. Mare's shoulders jerked. None of the other guardians spoke, but they all seemed to be in agreement with Albedo. To Momonga, however, her comments were unnecessary heckling. They weren't in a position to be concerned with such things.
Albedo, don't interrupt. I'm talking with Mare.
Even he was surprised at how deep his voice was.
My apologies, Lord Momonga.
She bowed low, her face frozen in fear. Sebas and the Guardian's expressions instantly stiffened as well. Although the reprimand was directed at Albedo, they must have taken it personally. From the sudden shift in mood, Momonga realized he'd said too much and regretted it, but he continued his discussion with Mare.
Is it possible to cover the walls with dirt and hide us?
Yes. That is, if you'll forgive me doing such a thing.
But if we were spotted from a distance, wouldn't a huge mound of dirt seem out of place? Sebas, are there any hills in the area? No, unfortunately it seems to be flat. However, I can't say for sure that I didn't overlook something, due to its being nighttime. I see. But if we want to conceal our walls, Mare's plan is a brilliant one. What if we mounded up dirt in the area to create dummy hills? In that case, we would stand out a little less. Okay. Mare and Aura, work together on that. Go ahead and take anything you need from the levels. We'll conceal the tall parts you can't cover later with illusions that will work on anyone not from Nazarick.
Yes, sir. Understood.
That was all Momonga could come up with for the moment. He felt like he was probably missing a lot of things, but they could always discuss them later. It had only been a few hours since the crisis began. Okay, that's it for today. Everyone take a break and then begin your tasks. It's hard to tell when we'll be able to take it easy for a bit, so don't work too hard. The Guardians bowed their heads in understanding. Finally, there is something I would like to ask each of you. First, Shaltir, what kind of a person do you see me as?
A concentration of beauty. You are truly the most beautiful person in this world. Jewels don't hold a candle to your fair body.
Shaltir replied promptly. It was obvious from the unhesitating speed at which she responded that what she said was what she really thought. Cocytus? You are stronger than all the Guardians, and truly fit to be an absolute ruler of the great tomb of Nazarick. Aura?
You're merciful and exceedingly considerate.
Mare?
I think you're super nice.
Demiurge? You are wise in judgment and always make use of your energy to get things done, and I think the word inscrutable describes you well. Sebas. You were the leader of the Supreme Beings, and now you are the merciful one who did not forsake us, but stayed. Last but not least, Albedo.
You are he who holds the highest position among the Supreme Beings, and our exalted master, as well as the man I love.
I see.
I think I have a sufficient understanding of everyone's thoughts now. I'm entrusting a part of the work my friends used to do to you. Strive to be ever loyal."
Momonga teleported away as the guardians humbly bowed before him again. The scenery changed at once from the arena to Lemegeton and its golems. Once he'd looked around to make sure no one was there, he heaved a sigh.
"I'm exhausted."
He wasn't experiencing any physical fatigue, but he could feel the mental weariness weighing down his shoulders.
"Why do they all think so highly of me?"
They must have me mistaken for someone else. As he was listening to them talk, he'd wanted to laugh and point out their error. He chuckled dryly and then shook his head. The looks on their faces and the mood in the room had told him they weren't joking. In other words, they'd been completely serious. If he didn't live up to their appraisal, they might be disappointed. The more he thought about it, the weaker he felt. And there was one other problem. Remembering it made him wince so hard it seemed like it would show on his skull.
What should I do about Albedo? I can't face Tabula like this.
Intermission. The pressure all but forcing their foreheads into the dirt vanished. They were all aware their creator and master, worthy of their worship, had departed, yet no one stood up. Some time passed before someone let out a sigh of relief. The tense mood relaxed. The first one to stand was Albedo. The places where her knees had pressed her white dress into the ground had gotten slightly dirty, but she didn't seem to care one bit. She fluttered her wings to shake the dust off her feathers. As if given momentum by Albedo's example, the others stood. Then scattered thoughts began to be voiced.
That was really scary, huh, sis? Seriously, I thought I was going to be crushed.
I'd expect nothing less from Lord Momonga, but to think that his power would affect even us guardians.
I knew that as one of the supreme beings, he was stronger than us, but I didn't realize by how much.
They all shared their impressions of Momonga. The pressure that had shoved them all toward the ground was the aura Momonga had been emitting. Aura of despair. It caused the fear status effect along with ability penalties. Normally it shouldn't have worked on NPCs the same level as him, but the staff of Ainzul Gon had boosted its effects.
Lord Momonga has shown us his caliber as a ruler.
Right. He had that authority all along, but he didn't exercise it until we gave our titles. The moment we presented ourselves as guardians, he unleashed some of his great power.
You mean he showed us his ruler side in response to our oath of loyalty?
That must be it.
Yeah, he wasn't giving off an aura at all when he was with us. He was super nice. He even gave us something to drink when we were thirsty.
The other guardians bristled. They were envious to the point where it showed. Albedo's reaction was especially big. Her hands shook, and it seemed like her fingernails were about to rip through her gloves. Mari's shoulders jerked, and he spoke up in a loudish voice.
So, that was Lord Momonga being all serious as the ruler of the Great Tomb of Nazarick, huh? Amazing!
The mood changed instantaneously.
You're exactly right. He responded to our feelings by behaving in the manner of an absolute ruler. I'd expect nothing less of our Creator, the pinnacle of the 41 supreme beings and our merciful master who remained with us to the end.
Everyone seemed enchanted, listening to Albedo's words, but only Mari's expression contained relief. The 41 supreme beings were their creators. Naturally, everyone was enveloped in incomparable happiness at having witnessed the true nature of one who deserved absolute devotion. The greatest joy of not just the Guardians, but anyone created by the 41 supreme beings, was to be of use. After that came being paid attention. This was only logical, of course. For someone created to be useful to the 41 supreme beings, what greater joy could there possibly be? Sebas spoke to disperse the lax atmosphere.
Well, I'm going to head back. I don't know where Lord Momonga went, but I should probably be serving at his side.
Albedo looked awkward for a moment, but recovered.
Got it, Sebas. Attend him respectfully, and if anything comes up, let me know immediately. If he calls for me, I'll go running at once, no matter what I have to cast aside.
Demiurge, listening to this, had a faint look on his face that showed what a piece of work he felt she was.
Oh, but if he calls me to his bedchamber, tell him I'll need a little time. I should bathe first. Of course, if he says to come as I am, I don't mind at all. I'm keeping myself as clean as possible and paying meticulous attention to what I wear, so he can summon me at any time. In other words, though it's only natural, Lord Momonga's wishes take priority.
I understand, Albedo. If I waste too much time here, I won't have as much to serve Lord Momonga. That would be terribly rude to him, so apologies, but I take my leave. Excuse me, everyone. After saying his parting words to all the dumbfounded guardians, he jogged off. Demiurge spoke as if to dismiss Albedo's look that said she hadn't finished. Well, it sure is quiet. What's wrong, Shaltir? Everyone turned to look at her. She was still kneeling. What is it, Shaltir? She lifted her head only after being addressed a second time. Her unfocused eyes glistened. Is something wrong?
That awesome presence was so thrilling that my underwear are in quite a state.
Silence. No one knew what to say, so they just looked at one another. Shaltir had the most twisted fetishes of all the guardians, and all they could do was facepalm when they remembered her necrophilia. Mare was the only one who didn't get it and stood there looking perplexed. But there was one present who wouldn't let that be the end of it. Albedo. Something like jealousy caused her mouth to open.
You bitch!
The insult caused Shaltir's lips to curl into an alluring smile.
Huh? Lord Momonga is one of the 41 supreme beings, as well as extremely beautiful. It's a reward to be hit with such a wave of power. You're crazy if you didn't get wet. Maybe you weren't made pure at all. Maybe you're just frigid. You big-mouthed gorilla. You lamprey!
They glared at each other. The other guardians didn't think it would devolve into a death match, but they still looked on with anxiety.
I was created the way I am by the supreme beings, and I have no complaints. Do you? You know, I'm pretty sure the same goes for me.
Shaltir slowly stood up, closing the distance between them slightly. Their eyes remained locked. They moved closer and closer together until finally they were bumping up against each other.
You must think you've won because you're convinced you get to be close to Lord Momonga just because you're captain of the Floor Guardians. But isn't that a bit far-fetched? Ha! Well, I do intend to achieve absolute victory while you're busy guarding the most remote area of the tomb. Pray tell me what you mean by absolute victory, Captain. A bitch like you ought to understand. Yes, I mean that.
During the exchange, their gazes didn't budge. They continued staring expressionlessly deep into each other's eyes. With a ruffling noise, Albedo's wings stretched out imposingly. In response, a black haze began to come off Shaltir. I'll leave the girls up to the girls. If something happens, I'll jump in to stop them, so just let me know.
What? Demiurge? You're gonna shove this off on me?
Demiurge backed away from the standoff, waving his hands in surrender. Cocytus and Mare followed. They didn't want to get involved. Good grief. Is this really worth fighting over? Personally, I'm quite curious what the outcome will be. What do you mean, Demiurge? Could be in terms of beefing up our war potential or the future of the great tomb of Nazarick.
What does that mean, Demiurge?
Demiurge wondered how to answer Mare's question. For a moment, the sadistic desire to spoil that innocent mind by filling it with adult knowledge reared its head, but he dismissed it without hesitation. Just like a demon should be, Demiurge was cruel and cold-blooded. But that was to outsiders of Nazarick. He saw others created by the 41 supreme beings as precious comrades in his loyalty. A great ruler should have a successor, right? Lord Mamanga stayed with us until the end, but he could lose interest in us and go where the others went. It'd be nice if he'd leave us someone for us to give our loyalty to if he leaves.
So you mean you wonder who'll be the heir's
That seems a bit disrespectful. It is our duty as guardians and creations to avoid that fate by remaining loyal to Lord Mamanga and working hard so he stays,
Cocytus interrupted. Demiurge turned to face him. Of course, I understand that, Cocytus. But wouldn't you like to be loyal to Lord Mamanga's son as well?
Ah, that does sound pretty good.
Cocytus imagined giving Mamanga's child piggyback rides, but he didn't stop there. He imagined giving him fencing lessons, drawing a sword to protect him from the oncoming enemy, and taking orders from him once he'd grown up.
Ah, how wonderful. I can see it now. Just wonderful. He can call me Uncle.
Demiurge averted his eyes from Cocytus and his uncle fantasies, wincing a bit. I'm also very interested to see what extent children could be of use in a plan to strengthen the great tomb of Nazarick. I wonder... Mare, want to try making some babies?
Huh? What?
That said, I suppose there's no one for you to do it with. If there are any humans, dark elves, or closely related species out there, I'll capture one for you. So how about it?
Huh? What?
Mare thought for a moment and then nodded.
If it would be useful to Lord Mamanga, then sure. But how do you make a baby?
Right. I'll tell you when the time comes. But, if we go off performing breeding experiments on our own, Lord Mamanga might scold us. Nazarick's upkeep costs must be pretty precariously balanced.
Yeah, I once heard that a single supreme being was spawning minions here on a very strict budget. If we make the population jump weirdly, we're sure to get scolded. I would hate for Lord Mamanga to scold me.
Well, same here. No interest in getting scolded by a supreme being. If we could build a ranch somewhere outside of Nazarick, that might work, though. Leaving off there for that idea, Demiurge tossed a question at Mare about something that no one had mentioned yet. By the way, Mare, why are you dressed like a girl? He tugged at the edges of his skirt as if to hide his legs even a little more.
This is what Bubbling Teapot chose. She said I was a boy, so I don't think there's any mistake about my gender.
She must have put some thought into it. Then that must be the proper attire for you. But I wonder if all little boys should be dressed the same way.
I'm not sure about that.
Although they had mostly disappeared, once one of the 41 Supreme Beings' sacred names came into things, all one could do was accept the judgment. That meant that the way Mare was dressed was the most correct way within the Great Tomb of Nazarick. If anyone was going to tell him to stop dressing that way, it would have to be another Supreme Being. I guess we need to consult Lord Mamanga. It may very well be the case that all boys should dress that way. Cocytus, are you quite ready to come back to us? At the sound of his colleague's voice, Cocytus emitted a sigh of contentment from the bottom of his heart, and then shook his head several times.
What a lovely notion. It certainly is something to hope for.
Oh yeah? Good for you. Albedo, Shaltir, are you still fighting? The pair, still staring each other down, looked up when he called to them. But the one who answered Demiurge's question was standing off to the side, looking exhausted. Aura.
The fight is over. Now they're just... The issue is simply who will be his first wife. We concluded it would be bizarre for the absolute ruler of the Great Tomb of Nazarick to have only one queen. But now we have to decide who his primary will...
That's very interesting, but tell me more later.
More importantly, Albedo, could you give us some orders, maybe? We've got a lot of things that need to get moving.
Yes, you're right. I need to give orders. Shaltir, let's discuss this further at a future date. I'm sure it will take more time than we have now, anyway. I have no objections, Albedo. There's nothing that will take us so long to discuss as this. Okay, very well. I'll come up with our plan going forward.
Albedo had put on her Captain of the Floor Guardian's face, and all the Guardians responded by bowing their heads in respect. They bowed, but they didn't kneel. She was worthy of respect as their captain, but she was not absolute. There wasn't that much of a gap in status between those created by the 41 Supreme Beings. That said, it was the 41 Supreme Beings who had bestowed upon her the rank of captain, so she was given the respect appropriate for her position, and no more. Their behavior was a manifestation of that belief, and it didn't bother Albedo, because she knew it was a most correct way to think. First,